something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to.
We are going to have a discussion today about and specifically Lauren's involvement in this particular movement. She's actually a veteran here in Eugene, and we're going to get a little bit more background on all the great work that she's done. So to begin with, how long have you lived in Eugene, and when did you get here?
I got here in 1994. Mm-hmm. So it's been like almost 18 years, 17, 18 years now. And
what was the decision to move? Were you going to school?
I was.
Okay.
I came out here for law school, basically, and I focused on environmental law, and the U of O Law School had one of the best environmental law programs in the country. And I had been out here many times for backpacking and whitewater rafting and really loved it, and at the time thought that I would just come out here for a discrete time period just to finish school. And of course, as so many people who have come out here for their education and never left, I just kind of fell in love with the place and the community, and I've been here ever since.
And so you started practicing law in Eugene, like after your program, 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, I graduated in 1996. My last year of law school, I worked for a 2-person public interest firm that did environmental law. Went to work for them and worked for them for about 5 years. And then they kind of folded up their firm, and I started my own law practice, and shortly after founded the Civil Liberties Defense Center along with my board of directors, which were lawyers and progressive social change activists and organizers.
Okay, so what exactly is the CLDC, and what was its initial focus, and how has it developed over time?
Well, so I would say one major motivating factor for the CLDC was all of our experiences at the WTO in 1999. It was probably one of the first mass protests that had a lot of legal organizing that went into it. And it was sort of after that time period that government and law enforcement really began cracking down on civil disobedience, and particularly environmental and social justice activists. And we were seeing a lot of people getting arrested and not necessarily getting great legal representation. And after they had been put through the ringer through the court system, they sort of abandoned the movements that they'd been involved with. They got burned. They felt they didn't have enough support. Often they would get fairly harsh punishments, expensive fines. We had some folks in Idaho that were involved in environmental protest, and they all ended up with like $1 million judgments against them to benefit logging companies. And so it was around that time period that I really kind of decided that one major way that I could support those movements and those activists were by really focusing in on activist defense, and not only coming up with legal defenses and briefs and memos and stuff like that to use in court, but also to sort of create a referral database of progressive lawyers around the country that would take cases on for free and would actually be part of the movements that they were also representing activists in. And I think one big benefit to my early start of my legal career is, I personally came from an animal rights and an environmental background, and then did environmental law for a lot of years. And So a lot of the clients, a lot of the people who got arrested protesting knew me from that work. I certainly understood the issues that they were working on, and certainly understood the importance and the value of risking your liberty for something you believe in, like the environment. And I think that there was, an immediate trusting relationship between myself and a lot of the activists that I worked with, because we had that solidarity. And after a bunch of them got tortured by police, I started taking on police misconduct litigation and suing the police and government for violating people's constitutional rights or abusing them by using excessive force. And we actually were able to take what had primarily been a real defensive stance and turn it into an offensive stance, and be a little more proactive in trying to hold police accountable for a lot of abuse that had been going on. I think anybody who's ever seen one of the WTO videos, and sees people being, tortured with chemical weapons or beaten with batons, the only way to stop that is by having lawyers take money away from those municipalities and to actually sue those police and draw a lot of attention to their actions. And that was all part of the plan.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to go back to, was for people that didn't know what happened in Seattle, I was going to ask you to give a little bit more background. But you've kind of covered it, that that protest in particular was a very violent protest for the people that were engaged in civil disobedience. There is a documentary, This Is What Democracy Looks Like, I believe, that goes into, if people want to see some of the footage of that, it was pretty intense. They definitely really subjected people to lots of unnecessary pain, and I know that you've also appeared in some documentaries around environmental activists, also getting the same kind of treatment subsequently over the years. So, has your work in particular? How has your work in particular really affected those policies? I know that you're not just talking about trying individual activist cases like in local courts. What is it that you do in particular, like where that really has longer term policy effects on these issues?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, a few cases we actually were able to challenge the laws that people were being prosecuted with, basically challenging whether or not they were constitutional or not. There was one case in Oregon where a lot of environmental protesters were charged with a statute called interfering with agricultural operations. And literally it was, if you hindered a timber operation, you could be guilty of this crime. And we challenged that, and the courts actually ruled in our favor and struck the law off the books. And the CLDC loves doing that wherever we can. There's actually a bunch of new laws now that have been passed in various states that are equally suspect and challenging unconstitutional laws and getting them thrown off the books is obviously a really proactive, effective way to not only support activists, but to get rid of laws that are going to be problematic over and over and over again. So
it sounds like you, on the one hand, offer direct and immediate legal assistance to activists and movements because of the burnout that you actually witnessed, where people would participate in direct action but then were not supported afterwards and decided to leave the movement. You saw the need to fulfill that.
Well, and we're getting hosed.
And we're getting, and exactly, that's what I mean. And they were not getting good support, and they were getting hosed as a result. But in addition to that, it sounds like you also take on particular cases, very specific cases, to try to challenge, the roots of some of these newer practices.
Yeah.
And was there, I think there was a recent case that had to do, I'll let you explain it, but there was just a recent case in federal court around surveillance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we represented an environmental activist who was cop watching, which basically means he had a video camera with him and he was filming the interactions he was having with the police. And this one particular police officer named Bill Soulsby with the Eugene Police Department basically was making all these false statements about the law. He was telling him that he wasn't allowed to protest there, he wasn't allowed to have a table, he wasn't allowed to remain stationary, and the entire time that this interaction was going on, Schlossberg was videotaping it so that he could bring the footage back to me, because he had come to our office in advance and had asked us, is this legal? Can I do this? He did everything he could think of to not get arrested while doing this activism. And he told the cop that he was video and audio taping him. And after the cop realized that he had made about 10 inaccurate statements of the law, he all of a sudden looks over at Josh and says, are you videotaping? Are you taping me? Are you recording me? And Josh says, yeah, I did tell you that twice. And the cop says, no, you asked me if you could record. You didn't tell me that you could. Give me that. That's evidence. And then he lunges at Josh and wrestles the camera out of his hand and throws him to the ground, and his head hits the pavement, and Soulsby puts his knee in Schlossberg's neck. And then after he handcuffs him, he says that he's going to charge him with intercepting communications. And then, without a warrant and without any consent, Soulsby begins to look at the contents of his video camera. And we represented him in the criminal courts, and the prosecutors decided not even to file the charges. And one of the DAs actually tells the cops, return the camera and don't look at it. We're not filing this.
Right.
And of course, Soulsby had already looked at it. So, to make a long story short, we filed a federal civil rights action alleging false arrest. We alleged an unlawful search and seizure of the camera, and then we alleged that the cop used excessive force in arresting him, and the jury came back unanimously and found him liable on all of those charges. And a couple of the important things that came out of that case was, number one, the judge ruled that in Oregon, the intercepting communications statute had a notice requirement, meaning all you had to say is, I'm recording you.
Right.
It didn't matter whether the cop heard you or whether the cop understood you. As long as you made the statement, you were protected under the law. And so now when we train cop watchers, we tell them, as long as you, clearly state into your camera that you're recording a person, they don't have to give you permission, and there's no lawful basis for them to tell you that you can't record if you're in a public place. And then the other significant ruling that kind of came out that will help activists in the future, this cop had charged Josh with resisting arrest. And in the police reports, what they accused Josh of doing was tensing up his muscles when he was attacked by the cop. So this kid is standing there and doesn't expect to be grabbed, and all of a sudden he's being attacked by a cop, and he tenses up his muscles, and the cop said that that was resisting arrest. And the court ruled that that was clearly not resisting arrest. And if I had $1 for every resisting arrest case that I've seen where that is what the police have alleged that the person did, as a basis for resisting arrest, I'd probably be a rich woman right now. So that was pretty significant and will likely help a lot of cases, particularly cases that are in sort of the protest realm, because a lot of times people who are intentionally engaging in civil disobedience, they will be locked to something, or they'll be locked to each other.
Right.
And then when the police, go to pry them away, maybe they tense up their muscles, or they hold themselves, in lock together. And under the ruling that was made by the court, it will have to be more than that in order to charge someone with resisting arrest in the future.
That's great. So for people that don't know, there's been a startling trend and increase in the amount of money spent on SWAT teams and public according to the actual statistics, they term it public safety, but an enormous expenditure in all kinds of different riot gear and protest gear and stuff like that. So these issues have obviously become more and more important, and that's fantastic. In addition, we know recently there's been this enormous increase in deportations, and some other work that you do that I know of with the Rural Organizing Project is going and talking to some of the immigrant communities in Oregon, and I just want you to talk a little bit about that work.
Sure. So in 2008, the federal government passed a law called the Real ID Act. And basically this makes it harder or impossible for undocumented people to get driver's licenses. And so it's gotten, now that it's about 4 years down the road, almost anyone that well, before that law was passed, undocumented people could get driver's licenses in Oregon, and they could get car insurance. And when this law was passed, it made it so that those people could no longer renew their licenses. And as their licenses began to expire, we have more and more people out on the roadways driving without driver's licenses and without insurance. Somehow this is a public safety benefit to us. But in the aftermath, what we started seeing is law enforcement using pretext stops as the basis to stop cars to determine whether they had driver's licenses, and if they didn't, that was an arrestable offense. So, someone driving to their job at an apple orchard would get stopped in a roadblock and asked for their driver's license, which, a cop is allowed to ask you for your license if they stop you for any traffic matter at all, a broken headlight, any little code violation they can find, they can stop you, and the first thing they're going to ask you for is your license. If you don't have a license, then now you are driving without a license, which is a misdemeanor, and it's an arrestable offense. So then you have local cops arresting these people who are ultimately found to be undocumented. They bring them to a county jail, and they alert ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, that they think they have an illegal person there. And then ICE goes and puts an immigration hold on them and begins the deportation process. So literally driving to work one morning and getting pulled over for a headlight out at the end of the day results in a deportation proceeding and families being split up just as a result of not having a license.
Is there any way that, just with better understanding of the process, that people can avoid that situation?
Well, there's not really a way to assist them right now in getting a license. Obviously.
No, but I'm saying to avoid falling into that, which appears to be a predefined or that's a sort of a trap that's been developed around the Real ID Act. Is again, like you say, to pull over for whatever pretense and to deport more people. But what do you do to help some of these folks understand how to avoid situations like that?
Well, one thing we're doing is we're traveling around Oregon, and especially hitting rural areas of Oregon that don't have a lot of access to legal resources, and we're doing intensive know your rights trainings and immigration rights trainings, where we're kind of teaching people what U.S. law is relating to how they interact with cops, the difference between cops and immigration police, and we're trying to give tips and advice for them to avoid that catastrophic situation, either by not driving or making sure that they understand what the vehicle codes are so they can try and make sure that their cars are as legal as possible, what to say to cops when you get arrested and what not to say. Right. For instance, most people don't know that you never have to allow immigration police into your home. So when ICE shows up, they're not allowed to just knock on the door and bust the door down. You have to actually let them in, which you should never do. But the other thing we're doing is, in Oregon, we specifically have a law that says that our law enforcement are not to be acting like immigration police. And the reason for that is the idea that local police are supposed to be protecting community safety. And if some people in our community are afraid to call the police,
Right.
if they, get in a domestic violence situation and they're afraid to call the police because they're in fear of being deported, then that makes everybody less safe and is a major public safety policy problem.
So was it the misdemeanor in the other case that you were explaining that really triggered the process of deportation? Or, I mean, if someone does come, call the police, say they're having a domestic violence situation and they're an immigrant that's undocumented, and the officer doesn't charge them with anything but isn't able to acquire any ID from them or something, can that process also be initiated if the officer makes a decision there? Is that what this law is supposed to prevent?
Well, no, I mean, the law is supposed to make it so that victims of crime will actually call the police.
Right.
Because right now in a lot of these undocumented communities, there's so much fear and paranoia that, they could have blood coming out their eyeballs and they're not going to call law enforcement for fear that they would be deported. In reality, a victim of a crime is not going to end up in a jail cell, which is where normally that deportation process is triggered. But we have racist cops that, will act like immigration police if they get the chance. And those are the ones that seem to be racially profiling brown-skinned people. And the other really unfortunate, repugnant situation is that a lot of these county jails, particularly rural county jails, sell jail beds to the federal government. And so they make money off of putting immigration detainees into their jails. So there's a financial incentive for some of these rural cops to arrest and jail immigrants, because then they get money from the federal government to jail that person, which is awful, but it's the way it's been working. And so in addition to trying to educate and demysticize some of the legal stuff for immigrants themselves, we also meet with police departments and allies of undocumented communities to try and not only sort of emphasize the fact that they're not supposed to be acting as immigration police and the reasons why they're not supposed to be doing that. The idea of keeping communities safe. We have those conversations. And then we also, meet with like communities, faith communities, or human rights groups and other individuals to try and give them information and advice on how they can stand in solidarity with these really threatened communities.
Oh, that's fantastic. Another issue that Occupy is starting to take up, and I know that the CLDC has already done some work on this, is the exclusion zone. So I think maybe you could just start off by explaining, what the exclusion zone actually is in Eugene, but then also if you could touch on, is this something that's becoming more common in other places, and under what guise?
Okay. Well, so the downtown public safety zone, otherwise known as the exclusion zone, was basically a box that was put around the downtown core of Eugene. And it was primarily pushed by business owners who wanted to ensure maximum profits for their businesses and felt that unsavory, homeless-looking people were deterring shoppers from
like panhandling or
or sitting in public spaces with their dogs, or being drunk, or there were all different things that were going on. And instead of looking at the reasons why people were hanging out in downtown Eugene, i.e. that they had nowhere else to go, basically, they basically in some ways sort of put a fence around the downtown core and said, we're going to make a concerted effort through law enforcement to kick these people out of this box or scare them out of the box, basically harass them enough that it would be uncomfortable for them to remain in this area. And the hope was that they would then go off into the surrounding neighborhoods, basically, which of course was not a great public safety rationale either. So they basically, if you're committing this long length of felonies, misdemeanors, and violations, and a cop rolls up on you and gives you a ticket for one of those things, in addition to giving you the ticket, they will give you what's called a show cause order. And the show cause order basically says that if you show up in court within 3 to 5 days, you can ask for a hearing to challenge whether or not you should or should not be excluded from this downtown zone for 90 days. So without even being convicted of a crime, let's just say, here's like the most common example. Almost all of downtown now has no trespassing signs everywhere. If you touch a brick building and you're a homeless person, that's trespassing. And so if a cop rolls up on you and gives you a citation for trespassing, they'll also give you this show cause order saying, okay, for 90 days from this date, you now can't go downtown. Can't go to the bus station, the library, the dining room.
But the bus station is the bus station. If that's what you use to transport yourself, you are literally not allowed to use that resource, even if your bus comes from outside of the exclusion zone into it?
Yeah, you can. There are certain exemptions. There are certain waivers you can apply for, but in general,
you have to apply for them.
Yeah, and I mean it includes the library, which is a huge resource for a lot of unhoused people. Not only is it a place to sit down and read and be out of the rain, but a lot of people use the computers to look for work or to apply for benefits or whatever it happens to be, and that's also part of this exclusion zone. So right off the bat, you haven't been convicted of a crime. You've only been accused of one by a cop. And most of the time, it really seems like there's a lot of selective prosecution going on here. If you happen to be a person with a backpack on your back, you are far more likely to get one of these show cause orders than if you are wearing high heels and look like a shopper. So then you've got 5 days, 3 to 5 days to show up in court and attempt to request a hearing. So you make it to court, you're a homeless person, you make it to court in this 3 to 5 day period, only to find out that this court hearing really had no purpose, and now they'll give you a hearing in another couple of weeks. You're still excluded, still haven't been convicted of anything, and you'll also be told that you can't get a lawyer to help you with this whole process.
Why?
Because it's not a misdemeanor or a felony, so you're not entitled to a court-appointed lawyer.
Oh, not entitled to a court-appointed lawyer.
And nobody can really afford to, to pay for a lawyer under these circumstances. So you come back for your second hearing, and this is a hearing where the cop's supposed to show up, and basically this is the hearing where you argue whether or not you should be excluded from the zone. In the meantime, that trespassing ticket is running on this parallel track, so you've got to show up for an arraignment on the trespassing charge, and then you're given another court date to come back on that one. And ultimately, if you're convicted of that trespassing charge, you take a plea deal or you go to trial and you're convicted, at that point, you're now excluded for 1 year from the date of the conviction. So you've had some amount of 90 days that you've been excluded without even being convicted of something. Once you're convicted, now you've got another year of being completely excluded from this giant swath.
And so, just as an example, if I've been excluded and there's a cop that has a certain beat that has excluded me and is in the downtown and just sees me there, is that considered to be...
You've violated
So it's a visual, nothing
order.
even has to happen if you're seen.
That's right. I mean, they actually for a while had Facebooks, of people that had been excluded so that those downtown beat cops could literally, flip through a photo album and see if you were one of the faces that they should be targeting.
So recently I heard that the newer estimate for homeless in this town is much, much higher than what we were quoting when we were discussing this issue during our occupation. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but maybe close to double what we had assumed. So If that's the case, naturally, one would expect that more of these exclusions will come into the courts. How are judges responding to this, I'm assuming, increased flow of violations?
Yeah, it's an incredibly increased caseload for the municipal courts to have to handle. And in fact, places like Ashland had actually debated and discussed whether or not they should do an exclusion zone for their downtown area, and they decided against it. And one of the primary reasons that they decided against it was that they didn't feel like their legal system had the capacity to handle that amount of increase. And ours doesn't either. Particularly, when you look at, right now we're analyzing 3 years worth of citations that have been issued in the downtown public safety zone and that had exclusion show cause orders that went along with them. And, roughly in a given month, there might be around 130 of these citations given out. And when you start breaking them down by crime, the vast majority of the tickets that were being issued were things like not crossing the street at a right angle or not having your dog registered. There were like 8 or fewer tickets every month that were actually for a misdemeanor or some kind of substantive crime. And of course, a large number of the tickets are just simply quote-unquote trespassing. A couple of the cases we're looking at right now were young homeless people who were standing over the heat grates trying to get warm in the middle of the winter here in Eugene and were ticketed for trespassing just because they were warming themselves in the dead of winter.
So what proportion of those would actually ultimately result in exclusion orders?
Well, I think of those are ones that, so that's a part of the statistic that we haven't gotten yet. What we've gotten were just the police tickets. Now we need to go and compare them to the court outcomes. But anecdotally, we know that a lot of the Eugene Municipal Court judges, if a person has the capacity to show up to all these court dates and actually speak on their own behalf and advocate for themselves, a lot of the judges are dismissing the tickets. And we've even heard that there have been a few judges that have actually told the downtown police officers that are regularly in their courtroom, don't come back here with this again. I'm going to throw every one of these out if you keep bringing them back.
And are they dismissing the show cause order or the actual charge?
Both.
Wow.
Both. And, sometimes the police will give someone one of those exclusion show causes so that the person is excluded right away, and then at some point the city drops the actual criminal charge. So the person's been excluded for a month or 2 months to just have their charge dismissed, which then does away with the exclusion zone, the prohibition. And there was supposed to be this advocate position. CLDC and the ACLU and other groups have been fighting this exclusion zone thing since it was first enacted. And as a result of a lot of lobbying and haymaking, the city finally agreed that, well, we're not going to give people legal representation, even though we know that the population that's coming into court are primarily homeless, either with mental health issues or, low education or, some kind of incapacity. And even though they knew that that population were the types of folks that deserved legal representation the most, they weren't going to give them lawyers, but they decided that they would put in an advocate position that would tell people what the process was and attempt to assist them in dealing with their exclusion thing. But in the years that that position has been in effect, I think they've had one phone call, and it was from somebody that was not even being excluded, that no one has been able to obtain assistance from this advocate position. And so that's basically completely ineffectual and is literally nothing. And, the taxpayers are paying for it.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. I know the data probably isn't there, but clearly this is using a significant amounts of city resources, at the very least the time of the cops chasing people down, writing them citations, court time and whatnot. And none of this money is being spent, obviously, on just social service for them. Maybe, one could think of just creating a place for people to go, to maybe use computers and stuff. We all know that the library is completely packed, and there's hardly, people have small chunks of computer time anytime they go in there, and it's always fully packed. So what does the city say in response to criticisms like that? Like, why don't you just do something to try to support these people rather than trying to exclude them?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding to at the beginning, that people were kind of chasing after, the wrong solution in trying to push homeless people out of the downtown zone, when in effect, we should have been looking at, well, okay, why are these people congregating here? Oh, it's because they have nowhere else to go, and this is the heart of the town and where all these resources are. If instead of, let's say, building LCC housing near the bus station, they had chosen to build a day center and actually give people a legal place to use computers, to sit on couches, bathrooms, showers, things like that, then you probably would see far fewer people out, lingering in those public spaces. But because there's literally nowhere else for them to go, that's where they're going. And you are right, these folks that are being charged into Eugene Municipal Court, not only have we increased the amount of funding we're spending on the downtown police and the private security, and that goes, a whole broad, they've had an active campaign to get almost every business downtown to sign a consent letter that basically lets the cops arrest anybody they want for trespassing without having to contact the business owner to see if the business owner actually wants the person arrested. So there was tons of money spent on that, and then you've got the cops, salaries themselves, and then you've got them arresting people and putting them in jail and the cost of a jail bed, and then you've got them coming to court 4 times minimally in order to go through the legal process. And ultimately, if the person is convicted, they have no money to pay fines, so there's no money coming back into the legal system to in any way compensate for any of these resources that are being spent through this whole process. Now, one kind of disturbing thing that's going on is, if someone is convicted for trespassing, let's say as an example, the court issues a fine, and the person is unhoused and has no money at all, so they have no ability to pay the fine, at which point the city says, oh, well, we actually have a work program for you. You can go clean up trash in downtown Eugene. And so you literally have this involuntary slavery system in place where homeless people are being targeted by the police because they're homeless. They're being prosecuted in a way that no one else in this town would be prosecuted. And then when they are ultimately convicted, they are being forced to clean up trash and work in the downtown zone.
Presumably in lieu of other workers that could actually be doing that for a wage.
Right. Union workers too, really. Because they're city workers that would normally be doing that. But, we've got budget cutbacks, paying those people less, and, every budget is, tightly strapped. But, the idea that, number one, that you're being targeted and prosecuted based on economic class, based on your appearance and the amount of money you have, but then also to see those same people being forced to labor in the community to work off their sin of being homeless is just sort of a vicious circle that really makes no sense at all, to me anyway.
Well, it's kind of like with prisoners, the same situation where they're in work programs if you go to prison, which we know the vast proportion of the increase in prisoners is petty drug crimes and whatnot. So maybe I thought we might take a step back. I have one more question about the exclusion zone, but I want to get to some of the broader issues here. But on the exclusion zone, is there any case that you know of? Is there any struggle that you know of in another place that we can perhaps learn from or discuss? I know that when I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, these laws were just coming into effect when I was leaving 8 years ago. They were called panhandling laws then, but they had the specific purpose of sweeping people out of that downtown area in front of the businesses that were becoming more and more gentrified, incidentally. And I'm just curious, since they've been around so long, I assume they have, is there any other examples that you can point to, any other positive?
Well, Portland also had, an exclusion zone, a sit-lie ordinance is what they called it, and they actually repealed theirs. And the basis for the repeal was because there was a profound racial disparity in people who were being targeted and prosecuted.
That violates civil rights laws, I see.
Well, I mean, they weren't actually litigated, they weren't actually sued for that necessarily, but the statistics were just, outrageous in terms of the disparity between people of color versus white people who were being targeted with this type of enforcement. And, Eugene, obviously, we have so few people of color to begin with in the downtown Eugene area, especially, that we won't necessarily see that issue. But we're certainly seeing, other forms of discrimination. San Francisco also had a sit-lie ordinance, which basically meant you can't loiter, you can't sit on a sidewalk or lie down on a sidewalk or whatnot. And they're still battling theirs as well.
Well, it sounds like the one here, though, is pretty, sort of intense or even more sort of unfair than some of these sit-lie ordinances, given that they can kind of cite you for such minimal things. These kids that were on the grate weren't even sitting down. I mean, they weren't lying down, sitting down. They were just kind of picked up. And obviously there's a lot of profile going on, but it's interesting that, obviously racial profiling really raises eyebrows. But, I mean, in my mind, profiling based on your class, basically, and the fact that you don't have a house, should be just as serious in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because I 100% agree, and I think a lot of people agree as well, that we shouldn't be targeting or, prosecuting people based on their economic class. The idea that, two people murder someone, one's rich, one's poor, you're going to arrest the poor person, most people would be like, oh gosh, that's unjust. Right. But when it gets down to this level of, people being picked up for crimes of basically being poor, people who have to urinate in the street because there are no public bathrooms. They don't have a home to go drink a beer in, so they get caught in a park. They have no place to sleep, so they get caught violating a camping ordinance. People have a harder time sort of really wrapping their head around the fact that that too is a form of discrimination, based on class. The tough part in the legal system is that, like, under the Equal Protection Clause, class and economic disparity are not considered protected classes like race or religion or ethnicity are. So you are protected if you have a certain race or if you have a disability or a certain religion, but being poor, or being homeless does not afford you any of that same protection. And clearly, that's primarily because, these laws and this system of justice that's evolved have primarily been developed by white, wealthy, people in power. And of course, that's why that disparity continues to plague the justice system.
And I would just add to that this is a capitalist country, a capitalist society that we live in, and really class has been worked into the Constitution even in certain ways. It's been naturalized. It's supposed to always exist, and you see a lot of the vicious hatred of people, of the homeless, by people in this town when you start to talk about some of these issues, because they want to blame them.
Yeah. And to tie in that immigration issue that we talked about a minute ago, now we have the proliferation of private prisons, private corporations running prisons, and one of the largest actually came out and blatantly said that the immigration population is their newest clientele. That they get to build all these new prisons because of all these deportation cases, so that deportation and immigration prosecutions are actually really good for their business. Which of course also ties into the fact that once these people are in those private prisons or even governmentally owned prisons, they are, like you mentioned, are being subjected to slavery and are being contracted out to corporations as extremely cheap labor. So, there's an even more incentive. I think it was something like, over 65% of the prison population are African American men at this point. And so, we've basically legalized a form of racism. And also, into that is this class issue where, we're going to arrest black men, we're going to take them off the street, we're going to put them in prisons together, and then we're going to use them as slave labor. The idea that slavery is dead, is a fantasy at this point and is becoming more and more real. And then if and when that person gets out of the slave prison, their voting rights are gone. Good luck finding a job. They normally don't have gun rights anymore, so they've lost substantive constitutional rights, and it's as if it's a reincarnation of slavery.
Yeah, this is it's a really interesting point. This is kind of where I wanted to try to conclude, because I know, as you said in the beginning, sort of the gist of your work is to really defend the right to protest, and I think that you would agree that we've seen a pretty significant assault over the last 10 to 20 years against that right. And I'm curious to know, or just to maybe discuss a little bit, what's your, like I know particularly you've done work around the Green Scare, which is really just, it's not really even over yet. There's still a lot of people serving time. There's even still some cases going on. And, I think that, you'd probably agree that this is sending a chill through people, especially after 9/11 and some of these more sort of unfair or very increasing laws that increase the scope of government, ability to surveil and also put people away, terrorism laws and whatnot. So just, maybe want you to talk about maybe some tips, or first a discussion about what is your sense of this situation? What direction is it going? How are people fighting back? And maybe then you conclude by talking about what you think Occupy sort of can contribute to, or what it sort of means in relation to these trends.
Well, I would definitely agree that in this post 9/11 environment, with the Patriot Act and the FTAA, and just last week
NDA.
we had NDAA. And just last week we had HR 347, which was this bill that was passed that basically now makes it a federal felony to protest at a national Secret Service event, basically. Any event where the Secret Service might show up to either protect a politician or some kind of mucky-muck event. If you engage in civil disobedience in one of those areas, it's now a federal felony to do so. And we've had laws like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act that makes it a crime of terrorism to basically protest animal rights related issues. All of these things, I always tell people there's no way that the government can lock us all up.
Right.
There's no way that the government can prosecute everyone who is an activist. And so clearly when they pass laws like this, it's not because they have the capacity to go out and enforce those laws. It's because putting them on the books and surrounding them with media attention scares people away from being activists and scares them from engaging in lawful, constitutionally protected activity, because most of these laws are so vague and they're so overbroad that people don't know where is the line between what is legal and what is not. For instance, I had a bunch of clients that every year, they were teachers and nurses, and every year they would go and protest animal circuses. And after the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act was passed, they didn't want to go do what they had done every year for 10 years because they were afraid that now all of a sudden their lawful First Amendment activities could be deemed terrorism by the government, and they were in fear of being prosecuted. And that's, kind of what we mean by chilling people's First Amendment rights. It's not necessarily with a gun in your face, or a jackboot in your face. It's a much more subtle, nuanced fear and coercion that sort of seeps into our society. And I always tell people, the number one thing we can do to combat that is to prove to the government that it's ineffective. Because if it works, they're going to continue doing it more and more. And so the best thing you can do to fight that type of government repression is to redouble your efforts as an activist, to be twice as effective as you were before. Because the reality is that the government has attempted to destroy a lot of movements in this country for many, many years. And despite all of their full-time employees with all the technology and tools and skills and guns and things that they've had, they have not managed to kill those movements. The environmental movement is kind of a good example of that. Despite all the infiltration and surveillance and prosecutions that have happened, there are more environmentalists or people who identify as being environmentalists today than ever before. And so, despite having a ball and chain around our necks and despite having to slog through mud, to be effective, we continue to be effective in the face of that. And I think that's probably the best way to combat government repression like this. And so in terms of Occupy, because it is such a broad movement and because it does have the ability to bring people from all walks of life and with all sorts of different issues and agendas and ethics and political views and employment backgrounds and all sorts of things, there is such a strength in numbers there. The police cannot round up everyone. We saw, even just in our own small Occupy movement, that the police and our local jail system did not have the capacity to arrest 100 people. That became an ability for us to be able to negotiate with law enforcement for things that we wanted to do, because the reality was that they couldn't arrest us all. And that strength in numbers is, I think, an essential part of the future of this movement. And I think that in the face of everything that's going on in the country right now, for many years, people just wanted to bury their heads in the sand and plug in the TV and sit on the couch and just wait to die, basically. And I think part of what the Occupy movement has sort of reawakened in people is this feeling of empowerment, that they can actually make some difference in their community and affect some kind of change. And I think that that is what we really have to embrace as a movement, despite any fear of police, to overcome fear and to look to the future and how you really want to live your life. Do you want to live your life on the couch and being afraid of everything around you, or do you want to find your voice and fight for what you believe in? Personally, I'd rather go down fighting than not.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very good point. Well, I think maybe wanted to close. You kind of started talking about it already, which is the sort of the power and strength and the solidarity that the Occupy movement has created, and I hope people realize that this movement is not going away. And one of the things that you are spearheading and some others in Occupy Eugene is an education series. And I thought maybe you might discuss a little bit about that series and what people in the community might find interesting about it or helpful. And maybe even just we can discuss a little bit, we can just have a conversation about why this has come about to begin with.
Sure. So I think that Occupy Eugene has been in existence for about 5 months now, and the vast majority of people that are involved in it don't have a lot of experience in other forms of activism, and certainly in organizing. So many times when I was down on the occupation site, a person would come up to me and say, I've never been to a protest before, or, older people would come up to me and say, I haven't held a picket sign since the 60s. There hasn't been any reason for me to get off the couch till now. And so my primary motivation in putting together this series was to put skills in people's hands. We have so many intelligent, committed, passionate, excited people within our movement that want to do great things, but they just they don't have the experience. They've never actually, organized a protest or organized a campaign. They want to do it, they just don't have the confidence yet to pull it off effectively. And rather than watch new people try and fail and maybe then think that they can't do it, I wanted to try to put the skills in their hands so that they would be successful in trying. Because one thing's very clear about this movement: when a movement is going to go on for a long time, you need a lot of people rowing the boat.
Right.
You can't just have a handful of experienced organizers trying to keep everything up in the air, because they'll burn out and it doesn't work. We need to duplicate the number of quote-unquote leaders that we have within the movement, and we need to really increase the number of people who are confident to plan events. And, up until now, Occupy Eugene has kind of been a little scattershot in our approach. Occupy Wall Street had so many different demands and so many different issues fold within Occupy Wall Street that we were kind of doing, or we are kind of doing, a little of everything.
Right.
Foreclosures and homeless people and the banks and pesticides and you name it, all these great and worthy causes. And part of what this series is going to assist us in doing is actually developing a strategic campaign plan and a strategy for Occupy Eugene. What are our goals going to be? What can we realistically undertake? And how can we achieve them? What does it look like to win? And how are we going, what tactics are we going to use to get there? How do we build solidarity within the movement? How do we grow the number of people in the movement? How do we work within coalitions with other existing organizations in our community to best make use of all of those resources? With the bottom line being, let's win. Let's actually get shit done. Let's actually make it so that we can, look back and say these things are crossed off our list. We have achieved these things, and we've already made some great achievements without even having this level of organizational planning in place. But my hope is that this will vastly improve our ability to be strategic and to bring in more people and to have even more success than we've had in the past. And so to do that, we have asked a bunch of different movements to come and help us do some of these trainings. So most of the trainings are going to be about 2 hours long once a week, and we've got a couple of all-day sessions that we have planned as well. For instance, on Sunday, March 18th, we're having a session from 10 to 5 with Dr. Gordon Lafer, who works with the
Labor and Education Research Center.
Right, here at the U of O. He's an expert in union movements and labor. He actually worked in Washington, D.C., and part of what he does is go around to different unions and help them organize and come up with campaigns, for wages and benefits and other things like that. And he basically works in a think tank where he writes and develops these types of strategies. And so he's going to come and help guide us to come up with our own plan, basically.
I'm going to have to cut you off right there because we're winding down, unfortunately. So just wanted to thank everyone for checking out this episode of